Within every human being, two forces coexist: light and shadow, power and compassion. Yet, only when power comes face to face with its own darkness do we see the true nature of leadership revealed. Today's story is not merely about a CEO who goes undercover. It is the inner journey of a soul wrestling with a deeper question: how can power serve humanity instead of controlling it? When Daniel Reyes, the CEO of the fast food chain Quick Bite, chose to shut down an entire restaurant just to protect an employee who had been humiliated, he wasn't simply acting as a boss. He was confronting the shadow of the very system he had built. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And sometimes, the truest light in leadership does not emerge from success, but from the moment one dares to look directly into the injustice one has created. This is the story of a leader who chose awakening over blindness. The story of a man who realized that true authority begins not in command, but in conscience. Part 1. The Undercover Leader. That morning, the city was still veiled in mist, its streets glimmering under the lights of early opening shops. On the top floor of Quick Bite's headquarters, Daniel Reyes stood silently by the glass window. Below, hundreds of restaurants were lighting up, thousands of employees beginning their shifts, and millions of meals would soon be sold. To the world, he was a successful CEO, the man expanding a fast food empire across the nation. Yet within Daniel, there was a strange emptiness. As if amid the noise of achievement, he had lost something unnamed. Quarterly reports declared rising sales, faster service, and a stronger brand than ever before. But then the anonymous letters began to appear. Managers yelling at staff. New hires receive no training. "We are just tools." Daniel read every word, a chill creeping down his spine. He realized he was running an empire he no longer truly understood. That was when the thought of going undercover emerged. At first, a curious experiment, but soon a deeper call, like a voice whispering from within. Go see what's really happening in the shadows you've created. A few weeks later, a new trainee named Adrian appeared on the employee list. He was a middle-aged man with clumsy hands and kind eyes, who once owned a small pharmacy that went bankrupt. No one knew that Adrian was, in fact, Daniel Reyes himself, the head of Quick Bite. Wearing an old uniform and a baseball cap, he quietly stepped into the world he had built, but never truly touched. The first store he worked in was on the outskirts of the city, a place where the smell of frying oil, the hum of machines, and the shouts of orders blended into a chaotic symphony. Daniel was assigned to the kitchen, where young hands moved endlessly, faces glistening with sweat. Marcus, the young employee, training him, was barely 20, working both day and night to support his ailing mother. He flipped chicken, answered calls, and apologized to angry customers waiting too long. Daniel soon realized no one here had ever been properly trained. The buttons on the machines were worn smooth, cooking times memorized by instinct rather than instruction. There were no procedures, only survival reflexes. Faster. Move it, the manager's voice barked from the drive-through window, cutting through the air like a whip. Each shout was a small wound in the atmosphere. Daniel struggled to keep up, his hands trembling, sweat pouring, buns burning black. When he was scolded, he simply smiled weakly. No one noticed the strangeness in that smile, the smile of a man tasting for the first time the heat of the world he had built. There were no strategies here, no boardrooms, only people, exhausted, silent, crushed beneath the machinery called efficiency. That night, when the store finally closed, Daniel stayed behind. The smell of grease clung to his shirt. His hands ached from minor burns. Yet that pain brought him something deeply real, a feeling he hadn't known in years, the sensation of touching life itself. He remembered Jung's words, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. No awakening can occur without passing through suffering." And Daniel began to understand that to truly see the light, he must first walk into his own darkness. the place where power had once blinded him, and where countless unseen workers now bore the shadow of his system. That night, in a small motel room, Daniel removed his wig and looked at himself in the mirror. The eyes staring back were no longer those of a CEO. They were the eyes of a man preparing for descent, not to inspect his employees, but to reclaim the soul he had lost. Part 2. The First Shock. That morning, Daniel walked into his first quick-bite restaurant under the name Adrian, a middle-aged man looking for a chance to start over after failure. The automatic door slid open, and the smell of oil and the heat from the kitchen hit him like a slap. The fryer hissed, customers shouted orders, and employees responded in chaos. Everything moved at a frantic pace, as if stopping for even a second would get you swept away. "New guy, come here, I'll show you," a voice called out. It was Marcus, a young man in his early 20s, sweat glistening on his brow, his eyes bright yet weary. He handed Daniel an apron and pointed toward the kitchen. "We don't have much time to train here. Just watch me and do the same." Daniel nodded, trying to keep up. Each burger had to be cooked at the right temperature, fried at the right time, wrapped precisely. But the machine's buttons were faded, and some no longer worked. Marcus moved like an automaton powered by instinct, flipping patties, wrapping fries, shouting orders across the kitchen. 3 number 5s, 1 number 7 with extra cheese, move faster. The manager's voice cut through the drive-through window, sharp, cold, and commanding. Daniel turned to Marcus. The young man stayed silent, hands moving tirelessly. "Did you get any proper training?" Daniel asked amid the noise. Marcus gave a faint, tired smile. "No. Everyone here just figures it out. You mess up, they yell at you, then you learn." A few minutes later, Daniel tried frying chicken, but he forgot to time it. The first batch burned. He hurried to throw it away, but the manager saw. "Adrian, you trying to burn the place down." The shout froze him. It had been years since Daniel had heard that kind of voice, full of rage and contempt, hurled at another human being like a burden. The kitchen went silent. Daniel bowed his head and apologized, feeling something crack open inside him. At lunch, Daniel sat quietly in the corner. Marcus still hadn't eaten. He gulped down a cup of water instead. "Why don't you take a break?" Daniel asked. "No time," Marcus replied softly. "I've got to clean up for the next shift. My mom's sick. I can't afford to lose hours." His words were light, almost casual, but inside them was an entire world of fear and responsibility. Daniel said nothing. He simply watched this young man who should have been learning, growing, becoming, but was instead fighting every day just to survive. That afternoon, when orders flooded in, the kitchen air grew thick. Daniel felt his heart pounding as he saw employees arguing over mistakes, Marcus being scolded for being a few seconds late. He realized everyone here was living in survival mode. No time to feel, no time to think, no time to find meaning. Each person was simply trying not to be yelled at, not to lose hours, not to get fired. For the first time in his life, Daniel, who had once sat in glass-walled boardrooms discussing productivity growth, was witnessing the real cost of those numbers. A culture built on fear, a rhythm of pressure where efficiency had become synonymous with endurance. When the shift finally ended, Daniel stepped outside. The afternoon sun fell on his shoulders, hot, heavy, like ashes. The smell of grease still clung to his clothes. In the car mirror, he saw his reflection. Not the face of a triumphant CEO, but of a man exhausted, having just walked through the hell of his own making. On the drive back, Jung's words came to him. There's no coming to consciousness without pain. No one becomes awake without passing through suffering. Daniel's first shock was exactly that. The moment when the curtain of success fell away, revealing the raw, fragile core of a system he once believed was flawless. He realized the problem wasn't in the procedures or the equipment. It ran deeper into the very psyche of an organization that had forgotten one truth. People are not tools. Compassion had been replaced by charts. Pride in one's work had been crushed beneath the slogan, faster, faster. That night, Daniel didn't go home. He rented a small room near the restaurant, opened his notebook, and wrote his first line. Day 1. I have seen my own shadow. Then he closed his eyes, and the image of Marcus appeared vividly, those tired, determined eyes, and that small flicker of faith that life was still worth trying for. Perhaps it was Marcus, not anyone else, who had helped Daniel begin his journey to rediscover the soul of a true leader. Outside, night fell. The neon sign of Quick Bite still flickered, like the heartbeat of a creature struggling to survive. And Daniel knew his journey had only just begun. Part 3. The Violent Leader. The air inside the Quick Bite restaurant that day was thick, charged with something that felt ready to explode. Daniel, wearing the old employee uniform, had just stepped out from the sink area when he heard it. "Hurry up! You trying to kill the customers or what?" The sharp, cutting voice belonged to Carl, the morning shift manager. A large man with a face perpetually flushed from anger, his eyes moved across the kitchen like twin blades. Everyone lowered their heads and kept working. No one dared respond. Marcus, the young employee Daniel had worked beside for days, silently wrapped the food, avoiding eye contact. He endured it quietly, as if he'd long since grown numb to it. "You come in late one more time, I'll drag you out and deal with you myself," Carl snapped, half joking, half threatening. Bitter laughter flickered and vanished. Daniel's chest tightened. He had heard of frontline pressure before, but never imagined it could be this cruel. Carl wasn't managing, he was ruling, and the employees weren't working. They were merely surviving under fear. During the break, Daniel sat beside Marcus. "How do you stand being spoken to like that?" he asked. Marcus gave a faint, hoarse laugh. "Because I need the money. My mom's sick. I can't risk losing the job." The answer was short, but it silenced Daniel for a long time. For the first time in his life, he saw a raw truth. When pushed to the edge, people no longer choose between right and wrong. They choose between existence and disappearance. From a psychologist's view, Carl Jung once wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. Where power dominates, love vanishes." Daniel looked at Carl and understood. The man wasn't truly evil. He was consumed by his own darkness, the shadow Jung spoke of, the hidden part every human carries but denies. Carl shouted not because he was strong, but because he was afraid of being judged, of losing control, of not being enough. When he poured that fear onto others, because deep down, he believed that if he wasn't the strong one, he would be the one devoured. Jung called this projection, casting one's inner darkness onto others so one doesn't have to face it within. But with every shout, the darkness in the restaurant grew thicker. Fear spread like a disease. Employees no longer dared to speak, to err, or even to dream of something better. Quick Bite, once imagined by Daniel as a second home for employees, had become a cold machine where human kindness was crushed beneath the weight of productivity. Standing in the corner of the kitchen, Daniel felt as though he was staring at his younger self, the man who once believed that only iron discipline creates success. Back then, he too had spoken in Carl's tone, only dressed in polite corporate words. And now, he was witnessing the outcome of that belief, a culture where respect no longer existed. When the shift ended, Marcus left silently. Daniel remained, listening to the rolling shutter slam down like a punctuation mark at the end of an exhausting day. In the empty room, something stirred inside him, not just anger, but guilt. That night, in his small motel room, he opened his notebook and wrote, "Power without consciousness becomes cruelty disguised as discipline." He realized that Carl was merely a mirror, reflecting the system Daniel himself had created, a system that rewarded performance without measuring compassion, that spoke of human values without ever listening to human voices. The next morning, when Daniel returned, he saw Marcus already there, wiping tables, fixing the broken fryer. No one had told him to, but he did it anyway. Because in this world, Marcus still believed, if he kept trying, maybe things would change. Daniel looked at him and recalled Jung's words from the undiscovered self. The world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you. Perhaps this was how the world was answering Daniel. Through Carl's shouting, through Marcus's silence, through the image of a workplace full of exhausted souls who still kept going, working, and hoping. In that moment, Daniel understood. To save his company, he couldn't just fix the process. He had to save its soul. And to do that, he would first have to face the darkness, not just Carl's, but his own. Part 4. The breaking point. That afternoon, the air inside the Quick Bite restaurant felt thick, heavy, like the humidity before a storm. The fryers hissed, the scent of oil mingled with tension. Outside, customers at the drive-thru grew impatient, while inside, Carl, the shift manager, shouted, his voice sharp as a blade, "Move faster. How many times do I have to say it? Faster." Everyone kept their heads down, silent. Daniel, still in his disguise as Adrian, the new hire, stood in the kitchen trying to focus, but his hands trembled. Not from fatigue, but from anger. For hours, he had watched Carl berate everyone, from the young cook Marcus to the cashier on the verge of tears. The insults cut deep, and everyone endured them quietly, desperate to keep their jobs. Carl barked again. "Idiot! How can you burn everything like this? You want to get fired?" Marcus lowered his head. "I'm sorry, I'll fix it." "Sorry doesn't bake bread," Carl snapped. That line, so cruel, so hollow, broke something inside Daniel. He turned, eyes steady, voice low but resolute. "No one deserves to be spoken to like that. I wouldn't work for someone who treats people like trash, not for a single hour." The room froze. The fryers went silent. The outside voices seemed to fade. Carl stared at him, stunned, then scoffed. "If I don't yell, they won't listen. This is the only way to keep control." Daniel said nothing for a moment. He looked at the man before him, someone consumed by power. The light in Carl's eyes wasn't confidence, but fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being seen as weak. Fear of not being respected. And in that instant, Daniel saw the truth he'd avoided for years. Violence doesn't begin with shouting, it begins with fear. And when fear disguises itself as management, it becomes a poison that spreads through an entire system. Carl Jung once wrote, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. Where power dominates, love disappears." Daniel realized Carl wasn't yelling at others. He was yelling at his own weakness. And in doing so, he had trapped the whole restaurant in what Jung called the collective shadow, a shared field of fear and repression. "You think you're managing," Daniel said slowly, "but you're just punishing." Carl clenched his fists. "What do you know? I have to keep this place running. If I don't yell, everything falls apart." "No," Daniel replied, meeting his gaze. "You yell because you're afraid. And because you're afraid, you've made everyone else afraid too." Carl stood still, lips pressed tight. Around them, the other workers began to lift their heads, eyes wide, shocked but grateful. No one had ever said aloud what they had all swallowed for months. After a tense silence, Carl threw his gloves onto the counter and stormed out, the door slamming behind him. The restaurant went still. Marcus exhaled shakily, eyes glistening. Daniel turned to him and said softly, "No one deserves that, Marcus. No one." As the crew cleaned up at the end of the shift, Daniel stayed where he was, feeling something unfamiliar rising inside. Part pain, part clarity. He knew he had crossed a line. He was no longer just an observer. He had stepped into a battle, not between men, but between power and dignity. That night, in the dim motel room, he opened his notebook and wrote, "Power without consciousness becomes cruelty disguised as discipline." For the first time in years, Daniel felt truly awake. He saw now that Carl was only a mirror, reflecting the darkness Daniel himself had once carried. The leader, who believed results mattered more than people, who thought fear was the only path to order. Now he understood, when compassion dies, discipline turns into chains. The next morning when Daniel returned, no one said a word, but their eyes were different. In the silence, there was gratitude. Marcus gave a small nod, a tired smile breaking through. In his heart, Daniel knew that yesterday had been a turning point. It wasn't just a confrontation between two men. It was the moment an entire organization was forced to face its soul. A moment of rupture where darkness was named, fear was seen, and one person dared to say, "Enough." Jung once wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality." Daniel had accepted that challenge, not with theories or strategies, but with the courage to speak truth in a place where silence had become the norm. When he left the restaurant that day, a light rain began to fall. Daniel looked up at the sky and took a deep breath. Perhaps that rain wasn't just washing away the grease and exhaustion of another long shift. It was cleansing something deeper, the shadow he had finally dared to face. Part 5. An unprecedented decision. That afternoon, the Quick Bite kitchen was eerily silent, as if every sound had been drained from the air. After the confrontation, Carl had stormed out, leaving behind a heavy emptiness. No one spoke. Only the hum of the old exhaust fan filled the room, and the cold fluorescent light cast its harsh glow over exhausted faces. Daniel stood in the center of the kitchen, still wearing his plain employee uniform, his hands stained with oil. He looked around. Marcus quietly wiping down a table, the cashier leaning against the wall, her face vacant. Everyone's head was bowed like faded shadows long accustomed to endurance. In that moment, Daniel understood. The problem was no longer about process, speed, or sales. What had decayed here was something deeper, the soul of an organization that had forgotten its people. The downcast eyes, the trembling hands, the weary sighs, they spoke louder than any report ever could. He felt it clearly. If he stayed silent, he would become part of the darkness. And for the first time in his career as a leader, Daniel thought not of profit, not of reputation, but of dignity. His voice broke the stillness, calm but resolute. "Stop everything." Heads turned. Marcus blinked, unsure he'd heard right. "No more," Daniel said slowly, articulating every word. "We're not taking another order. From this moment on, this restaurant is closed." The words fell like thunder. One of the girls stammered, You mean it?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, I mean it." The air froze. Outside, a few cars still waited in line. One employee hesitated, glancing toward the window, then back at Daniel, the man they still believed to be a simple trainee. Daniel looked at them gently. "I know you've all done your best. I've seen you work without rest, even when you were tired, even when you were scared. But if we keep going like this, we won't just ruin the food. We'll ruin ourselves." No one replied, but Daniel could feel his words strike something deep within them, a place they thought had long died. A young woman's eyes filled with tears. Marcus nodded faintly, a fragile spark of hope flickering in his gaze. "You're not losing your jobs," Daniel continued. "No one's being blamed. Everyone will still be paid. But this store won't reopen until we fix everything, our equipment, our process, and most of all, the way we treat each other." His tone wasn't dramatic, yet it carried the gravity of an unprecedented act. No CEO in Quick Bite's history had ever done such a thing, shutting down a store mid-shift, not for profit, not for operations, but for morality. Daniel knew what this decision would cost. The board would rage, customers would complain, but he no longer cared. In that moment, he wasn't acting as a CEO, he was acting as a human being. Carl Jung once wrote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man." And Daniel realized the same was true of his company. No system could stand if its inner soul had already cracked. As he turned off the kitchen lights, the space fell into the muted glow of late afternoon. The machines went silent. A strange peace settled over the room. No voices, only the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He turned to Marcus. "Are you scared?" Marcus hesitated, then said softly, "Yeah, but also relieved. I think, for the first time, someone finally said what's right." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm scared too, Marcus, but sometimes fear is exactly what forces us to change. Jung once said, there can be no transforming of darkness into light and of apathy into movement without emotion." And Daniel felt that truth deeply. His anger, his compassion, his remorse, they merged into something new, not power but awareness. Outside, the last sunlight streamed through the glass, laying a soft golden hue across the floor. Daniel stood there, feeling as though he were witnessing a ritual of cleansing. It wasn't destruction, it was renewal. He exhaled, whispering to himself, "Today I didn't close a restaurant. I closed her blindness." Marcus overheard and smiled faintly. He didn't fully grasp the words, but he could feel their truth. When Daniel stepped outside, dusk had fallen. A gentle breeze rustled the billboards, making them tremble under the streetlights. He looked back one last time, the Quick Bite sign glimmering faintly in the reflection of the glass, as if the company itself was beginning to see its own reflection. Inside his heart, a quiet voice rose, not from reason, but from the deepest part of his soul. Sometimes, to heal, you must have the courage to stop. And perhaps, Daniel thought, that was the greatest lesson of all, the moment a leader finally learns to reclaim the heart he had lost. Part 6. Taking. Responsibility. That morning, a pale gray sky cast a cold light over the Quick Bite restaurant. The young employees arrived early, lining up quietly as usual. No one spoke much, only the hum of the coffee machine, the sound of shoes against the floor, and the anxious glances they exchanged. None of them knew what would happen after Daniel, the strange new employee who had shut down the restaurant the day before, walked in. Daniel entered, still in his simple uniform, the brim of his cap shading half his face. But today his eyes were different, calm, deep, and bright, as if he had made an irreversible decision. He asked everyone to gather in the center of the kitchen. The smell of oil lingered in the air. The old exhaust fan rattled softly. The dim neon light cast long shadows across tired faces. The team formed a loose circle. Marcus stood next to the petite cashier, still fumbling with receipts. No one dared to meet his eyes. They waited, for punishment, for blame. But what they heard instead was something no one in this kind of workplace had ever heard before. "You did nothing wrong." Daniel's voice was steady and low, but it carried. The room went still. A few glanced at each other, as if unsure they'd heard him correctly. Daniel paused for a moment, then continued. "The fault is not yours. You weren't trained properly. You weren't given the right tools. And more importantly, you weren't respected. If you failed here, it's because leadership failed you." The air seemed to freeze. Marcus slowly lifted his head, eyes wide. No one had ever said that to them before. In all their years at Quick Bite, every mistake, no matter how small, had always been their fault. But today, someone was standing before them and taking the blame upon himself. Daniel looked around the kitchen, the grease-stained walls, the broken buttons, the old wheezing refrigerators. Everything reflected the image of a system that had forgotten its people. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from genuine emotion. "I've seen how hard you work," he said quietly. "But when the system is wrong, you can't expect people to be right. When the tools are broken, you can't blame the ones who use them. And when there's no respect, you can't expect loyalty." A young woman began to cry softly, wiping her tears on her sleeve. Marcus lowered his head, lips pressed tight. Daniel stepped closer, his tone gentle now. "This restaurant will reopen, but not today. Not until everything is fixed. You'll all keep your jobs. You'll all be paid in full. But from now on, we'll do things the right way, from the ground up." There was no judgment in his gaze, only faith. And that faith spread like a small flame in the cold, No one said a word, but they didn't need to. Each person felt something stir inside, a feeling long forgotten, the feeling of being seen. Marcus finally looked up and asked softly, "Why are you saying this? You're not even a manager." Daniel smiled, a gentle, almost sorrowful smile. "Because I used to be one of you," he said. "I was looked down on by people above me, and I know how fast that feeling can destroy your self-worth." He paused, then added, "But today I want you to remember this. No one here is disposable. No one deserves to be yelled at, humiliated, or disrespected because of their job. We're not just selling food, we're serving people." The room fell silent again, but this silence was different, warmer, fuller, alive. Marcus smiled faintly, then nodded. "I'll come back. When this place opens again, I want to start over, with everyone." Daniel nodded back, and in that moment something inside him loosened. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." Daniel understood that now. He was facing his own shadow, the part of him that once believed pressure and strictness were the only ways to keep order. But now he saw that compassion was the real force that held an organization together. When the meeting ended, people left one by one, but no longer with bowed heads. Some patted each other's shoulders. Hesitant smiles appeared. None of them knew who Daniel truly was, but they knew one thing. Something had changed. Daniel stayed behind in the empty kitchen. The midday light filtered through the small window, falling across his tired but peaceful face. He sat down, opened his notebook, and wrote, "True leadership is not about control. It is about responsibility. The courage to say, 'It was my fault.'" Outside, the sky had cleared. Sunlight reflected off the Quick Bite sign, making it shine brighter than usual. Daniel looked up at it, knowing this wasn't the end. It was a beginning. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly leading, not through command, but through truth, not through power, but through humanity. And in that moment, he finally understood what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That day, Daniel was no longer the undercover CEO. He was simply a man, learning again how to lead with his heart. Part 7, The Night Shift with Renee. That night, the city slowly sank into silence. The dim streetlights cast pale reflections on the rain-soaked pavement as Daniel drove toward a small quick-bite restaurant on the outskirts of town, a lone beacon of light in the sleeping city. Tonight, he would work the night shift alongside a manager named Renee. The glass door swung open, releasing the familiar mix of frying oil and stale coffee. Inside, only 4 employees were working, yet the space felt alive. Renee, a woman in her 40s, stood at the drive-thru counter, headset on, taking orders while joking with customers through a static-filled speaker that barely transmitted her voice. "Yes, sir. No cheese, right? Got it. Thank you. And hey, next time, don't come out this late. The wind's freezing tonight." Her voice was light, warm, almost melodic. Despite her fatigue, visible in her gestures and posture, Renee carried a kind of quiet radiance. She wasn't just selling food, she was offering warmth, in a world that had forgotten what gentleness felt like. Daniel watched her. Every movement, every smile seemed to come from a place beyond professionalism, from the heart. She moved through the kitchen like a conductor, handing out drinks, calling out orders, keeping an eye on her team as they juggled fryers and timers. But beneath her grace lay a crumbling system. The drive-thru speaker was so broken that customers had to repeat their orders 3 times. The soda machine shook violently whenever turned on. The ancient register lagged so badly that each order had to be entered twice. And above all, every worker labored under the same relentless pressure from headquarters. Faster, more accurate, no mistakes. Daniel approached her quietly. "You've been working like this every night." Renee smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Yeah, we're used to it. Around here, no one waits for things to be perfect before doing the job. If we did, this place would have closed long ago." Her tone carried both humor and resignation. Daniel felt a mix of admiration and sorrow. There was something in her voice that reminded him of the women who had once carried his company through hard times. Women without titles or shares, yet who bore the soul of the brand itself. Carl Jung once said, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order." And Daniel realized that in the chaos of sizzling oil and static noise, Renee was the secret order, an invisible harmony built from kindness and care. Around midnight, business slowed. Then the intercom finally died, emitting nothing but static. Renee tried a few times, then laughed softly. "Well, I guess it's tired too. Just like us." Everyone laughed. And yet, instead of giving up, they adapted, stepping outside to take orders directly from car windows under the cold wind. Daniel marveled at their resilience. "You're not angry?" he asked. Renee shrugged. "What good would that do? If the speaker's broken, we fix it. If customers wait, we apologize. I just don't want my team to lose their temper. If I don't stay calm, who will hold this place together?" Daniel said nothing. In that moment, he understood. Renee wasn't just a night shift manager. She was the invisible anchor holding together a system that had forgotten how to care. At 2 a.m., Renee poured him a cup of coffee, both hands cradling the cup before handing it over. "Here, drink. The night's still long." Daniel took a sip. The bitterness lingered on his tongue, but a quiet sweetness rose in his chest, the sweetness of gratitude. "Renee," he asked softly, "how do you stay so hopeful when nothing around you seems easy?" Her eyes gleamed with gentle wisdom. "If we stop being kind, everything gets worse," she said. Jung was right. What you resist persists. So I don't resist. I just try to soften it. Daniel froze for a moment. He had quoted that line in leadership meetings, seen it in books, but never had it sounded so real. From the mouth of a woman who worked 12-hour nights, it became a living truth. Near 3 a.m., the store finally closed. Renee shut off the lights one by one until the glow faded, leaving only the sound of the wind whispering through the cracks. Daniel stood still, watching her shadow stretch across the tiled floor. A small woman carrying the weight of an entire world with her smile. As she locked the door, he said quietly, "You know, I think this company survives because of people like you." Renee smiled, turning to him. "And I think it will only truly grow when the people up there remember the people down here." Her words stayed with him the whole drive back. The city slept, but inside Daniel something had awakened. A new awareness of compassion, of responsibility, of how true leadership begins by listening. Before dawn, he opened his notebook and wrote, "She doesn't sell food. She sells comfort. She reminds me that leadership is not about speed, but about presence." And as the first light of morning broke, Daniel understood. This wasn't just a night shift. It was a lesson, an awakening. In the flickering glow of a neon sign, he had seen the one thing his entire company was losing: the human soul. Part 8. The Truth from the Front Lines. The car rolled quietly along the damp suburban road after a night of rain. Streetlights glowed dimly, their golden light reflected on the wet glass, casting blurred streaks across the windshield. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, staring out into the night. It was long past midnight, yet he felt no fatigue. Something within him had been stirred, something that began during his night shift with Renee, the woman whose luminous eyes reminded him that compassion could still exist even within the cold machinery of a corporation. Renee was driving. She cracked open the window slightly, letting the night wind drift in. Her loose hair moved gently in the breeze. Without Daniel asking, she began to speak, her voice calm, even, yet carrying the weight of buried memories. "You know," she said, eyes still on the road, "I used to survive because of this company." Daniel turned to her, surprised. She smiled, but her smile carried a trace of bitterness. 10 years ago, after my divorce, I had to raise 2 kids alone. I had no money, no house. Some days, the only thing in our fridge were a few quick-bite meal coupons. That's how I fed my children." Her words struck Daniel like a quiet storm. He remembered approving the free meal program for low-income families, but he had never imagined that one of the very people serving the system had once depended on it to survive. He looked at her, speechless. "I'm grateful to QuickBite," she continued. "It kept me alive through the worst time of my life. But you know what hurts the most? That now, the people at headquarters don't understand us anymore. They make decisions based on surveys and spreadsheets, but they don't see the humans behind the counter." She let out a weary laugh. "The menu changes all the time based on nationwide statistics. They say the light version is the top favorite. But here, people like spicy food, strong, flavorful. I told them that again and again, but nobody listened. Corporate just said, stick to the plan, no personal opinions here." Daniel felt his throat tighten. Stick to the plan. Those were his words, the slogan he himself had created during the company's expansion years. Now, hearing it repeated back, it sounded like an indictment. Renee went on, her tone soft like the wind. "I once sent emails suggesting local promotions, like a buy one get one event for the town festival. I thought it would be fun, keep our regulars close, but they never replied. When I called, someone on the other end just said, 'Noted, acknowledged,' then silence. Around here, we're not allowed to ask why. We only say, 'Yes, understood.'" Daniel lowered his head. Through the hum of the engine, he could hear his heartbeat. Slow, heavy. Only say, "Understood." Such a small phrase, and yet he could hear in it the death rattle of a system that had lost its soul, a place where people existed not as humans but as replaceable cogs in a machine. Carl Jung once wrote, "The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." And Daniel realized that QuickBite was hanging from that same thread. Every frontline worker like Renee was part of the company's psyche, and if that thread broke, the entire structure would collapse. The car stopped at a red light. The glow painted Renee's face in shades of crimson, revealing the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the marks of countless sleepless nights. Yet her gaze remained calm, warm, and steady, like someone who had made peace with hardship. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" Daniel asked softly. Renee was silent for a moment, then replied, "Many times. But every time I think of quitting, I remember the young kids who work with me. Some are students. Some are single mothers like I was. I'm afraid if I leave, they won't last. Who will protect them when customers yell, when the intercom breaks, when corporate demands reports without understanding what it's like down here?" Her voice trembled slightly, but her tone stayed firm. "I don't stay for the company. I stay for the people." Daniel turned to look at her, realizing he was sitting next to an ordinary woman carrying a strength that many leaders lacked, the strength of compassion. Jung once wrote in Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity." Renee didn't need corporate intellect. She lived by intuition, the natural intelligence of the heart. She didn't invent new products. She created what QuickBite was losing most: humanity. As the light turned green, the car rolled forward again. Daniel gazed out the window, at the dazzling signs, the bright marketing slogans. But through all that light, he could only hear Renee's calm voice echoing in his mind. "We're not allowed to ask why. We only say yes." He realized that he had built a system where silence was called discipline and curiosity was labeled rebellion. And in that silence, the company's soul had slowly vanished. When they reached the end of the road, Daniel said quietly, "Thank you, Renee. You just told me something no report could ever say." She smiled faintly. "I only said what everyone already knows. It's just that no one's allowed to say it out loud." Daniel gave a sad smile. "Maybe I needed to hear it. It's been too long since anyone's spoken honestly to me." The car stopped in front of a small hotel. Daniel opened the door. The night air rushed in, cold, damp, carrying the scent of grass after rain. Before stepping out, he turned and said, "I promise, Renee, one day your voice and the voices of people like you will be heard." Renee looked at him, her eyes kind but unwavering. "I don't need promises. I need action." Daniel nodded. The door shut softly. The car drove away, leaving him standing in the quiet street listening to the wind, its sound both painful and illuminating. That night, in his small motel room, Daniel opened his notebook and wrote a single line. "The truth from the front lines is the mirror of the soul, raw, imperfect, but real." And he knew then that he had finally seen that soul, not in glass towers or boardrooms, but in an old car under the streetlights, where an ordinary woman shared her story of survival, and unknowingly awakened the heart of a leader who had been lost for far too long. Part 9. Alicia, the keeper of the kitchen's rhythm. That morning, sunlight streamed through the glass window of a suburban quick-bite restaurant. The sound of frying oil sizzled, the scent of grilled buns blended with the aroma of fresh coffee. Daniel stood at the end of the counter, wearing a new apron, quietly observing the small woman who moved through the kitchen with almost impossible speed. Her name was Alicia. After 7 years with the company, she knew every recipe by heart. She could tell what a customer wanted just by hearing half an order. No notes, no hesitation. She worked as if every procedure had become part of her breathing rhythm. But what struck Daniel most wasn't just her skill. It was the way she made the entire kitchen move like a symphony. The cashier, the fryer, the burger assembler, all followed her rhythm. When Alicia sped up, everyone else naturally adjusted. When she paused, they instinctively checked their orders. No one spoke loudly, yet the kitchen ran so smoothly that Daniel felt as though he was standing inside an invisible melody only Alicia could hear. He watched her hands move swiftly, hair damp with sweat under the harsh white lights. In that moment, Daniel realized that behind every cold statistical number about average service speed were living, breathing people who poured every ounce of themselves into their work. During a short break, Daniel sat down beside her at a metal table. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Alicia smiled, wiping her hands with an old towel. 7 years. I started when I didn't even know how to stack a sandwich properly. Now I could do it with my eyes closed." 7 years is a long time, Daniel said. "Have you ever thought about becoming a manager?" She hesitated, then sighed softly. "People ask me that all the time, but the pay raise isn't much, and the responsibilities multiply. Paperwork, staffing, inspections. My car's old. It breaks down a lot. There were days it died in the middle of the highway, and I had to push it for miles just to make it to my shift. If I were a manager and came in late, I'd get penalized, so it's easier just to stay here on the line." Her words hit Daniel deeply. He looked at her, feeling a quiet ache of shame. After 7 years of hard work, someone like Alicia still had to push a broken car just to arrive on time. Meanwhile, at headquarters, executives debated for hours about customer behavior analytics and efficiency metrics. Carl Jung once wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases." Daniel realized his company had been forcing everyone to wear the same pair of shoes, the shoes of productivity, procedures, and performance metrics, forgetting that each person walks a different path. The fryer buzzed again. Alicia stood up without being asked. She resumed working, her voice calm and steady. "You know, if I stop for 5 minutes, the kitchen falls apart. So I keep going, because somebody has to." Daniel watched her with quiet admiration. She didn't speak of passion or self-development. She simply worked, calmly, steadfastly, as if her very presence was the thread holding this small world together. Carl Jung once called this the quiet heroism of endurance. Alicia didn't need recognition. She wasn't chasing titles. But in a world that often overlooks such people, she embodied a rare kind of heroism, the heroism of quiet perseverance. To Daniel, Alicia wasn't merely an excellent employee. She was an archetype, the keeper of rhythm, the one who maintains order amid chaos, the one who keeps things moving when everything else threatens to collapse. She was like Persephone in Greek mythology, the goddess who descends into the underworld each winter to ensure that life continues. If QuickBite was a world of industry, then Alicia was its soul. When her shift ended, she removed her gloves, wiped her brow, and smiled at her teammates. "That's it. Record time today," she said. Daniel looked at her sun-browned hands, seeing small scars, healed but still visible, traces of thousands of hours of labor. Those hands didn't just make sandwiches, they kept alive the belief that work could still mean something human. He whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." She smiled gently. If everyone gave up, who'd make the meals for the customers? Daniel was silent. In her simple answer lay a truth he had long forgotten, that behind every warm burger was not just a recipe, but a heart still beating, still trying. That night, back at his hotel, Daniel sat in the dark, staring at his notebook. He wrote, "Some people keep the lights on, not with power, but with dignity." He closed the notebook, wondering if all the Alicias in this company stopped working for a single day, would QuickBite still exist? The answer sent a chill down his spine. In a world driven by speed, where people are reduced to charts and metrics, there are still those who quietly keep the rhythm alive. People like Alicia. She wasn't an employee. She was the heartbeat of the system. A living reminder that the true strength of any organization lies not in its speed, but in the dignity of the people who serve. Part 10. The bigger picture. 7 days had passed since Daniel first put on the red uniform of QuickBite. 7 days of 10-hour shifts, filled with the hiss of fryers, the impatience of customers, and endless weary apologies. 7 days for a CEO, a man once surrounded by luxury boardrooms and polished financial reports, to realize that beneath the shiny mask of success lay a different world entirely, a world of sweat, exhaustion, and people slowly being devoured by the very machine they served. During that week, Daniel met Marcus, the young man so humiliated he had lost faith in himself. He met Renee, the woman who hid her fatigue behind a smile, still gentle with customers even when the intercom had long been broken. And he met Alicia, the woman who kept the rhythm of the kitchen with her calloused hands, still smiling even when her car died in the middle of the road. They were different in age and circumstance, but they shared one truth. Each had given far more than they ever received. One evening, after an exhausting shift, Daniel sat alone in the storage room. There was no glow of office lighting here, only the scent of cardboard and the whir of an old fan. He leaned against the wall, removed his gloves, and stared at his hands, darkened by grease, marked with tiny burns. For the first time in years, Daniel felt his own body, tired, aching, but real. And in that moment, he understood something profound. He'd never truly known what his company was. Until now, QuickBite had existed to him only as numbers, revenue, speed, profit. But the real QuickBite lived here, in the people who silently carried the weight of the system, in the weary sighs no one ever heard. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." And Daniel realized QuickBite had been doing the same. The company was expanding at breakneck speed, chasing seconds, pushing every limit of productivity, yet failing to invest in the most important thing of all, its people. The frontline workers, those who faced customers, who kept the rhythm of the brand alive, were treated as disposable, interchangeable parts in a faceless machine. Daniel wrote in his notebook, "We measure speed but not exhaustion. We count the burgers sold, but not the souls quietly fading away." In every store he visited, he saw the same painful truth. There was no consistency in how people were treated. In one place, managers yelled and humiliated staff. In another, the most dedicated employees went unnoticed, unrewarded, unheard. The culture of respect, the foundation of every lasting organization, had cracked from within. The more Daniel observed, the clearer it became. The problem wasn't in the system's process, but in its soul. QuickBite didn't lack skill or technology. It lacked meaning. Work had ceased to be a contribution. It had become mere survival. Jung once wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes." QuickBite had become just such a crowd, a vast growing empire opening hundreds of stores each year, while each person inside felt smaller, more exhausted, more invisible than ever. And Daniel realized, painfully, that he had helped create it. He had once taken pride in growth and market share, blind to the fact that those metrics were built upon the fatigue of thousands who had no voice. Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." QuickBite, Daniel thought, was being driven by its own collective unconscious, one rooted in fear, fear of falling behind, fear of loss, fear of slowing down, and in forgetting its humanity. He, too, had been its victim. That night, he closed his eyes and envisioned the entire system. Restaurants glowing through the night. Employees staying awake through endless shifts. Managers crushed under profit targets until they forgot how to be kind. A machine that ran smoothly, yet felt hollow. A company alive, but soulless. Jung once wrote, "Where love rules, there's no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking." And Daniel saw it clearly. QuickBite had allowed power to rule for too long. The power of speed, of rankings, of performance charts. And in that rule, love for the work, pride in one's craft, and trust between people had slowly vanished. The next morning, as he stepped out of the restaurant, Daniel no longer felt like an undercover boss. He felt like a therapist listening to the soul of a patient, a wounded, exhausted soul still struggling to survive. QuickBite didn't need another business strategy. QuickBite needed healing. On his way back, Daniel wrote one more line in his notebook. "The greatest danger to our future is not failure, but forgetting what makes us human." And in that quiet moment, he understood. If he wanted to save the company, he would have to awaken its soul, to help everyone remember that each uniform didn't just represent a brand, but the dignity of a human being trying to live. Daniel's undercover mission was no longer a corporate exercise. It had become a spiritual journey, a descent into the shadow to rediscover the light, the very process Jung described as individuation. And that night, as the city lights shimmered against his car window, Daniel whispered to himself, "No company can ever be truly great if it forgets how to treat people with kindness." Part 11. The Revelation and the Actions that Followed. That morning, sunlight streamed through the spotless glass of QuickBite's model store. The air felt different, still, solemn, and strangely warm. Marcus, Renee, and Alicia had been invited to a special meeting with a representative from headquarters. None of them knew what to expect. None could imagine that this day would change their lives and the soul of QuickBite forever. In a small room behind the kitchen, Daniel Reyes waited. He wore no suit, no tie, just a simple shirt and eyes that carried quiet depth. Before him were the three people he had worked alongside. People whose sweat and smiles he had witnessed up close. When the door opened, they entered hesitantly. "Hey, Adrian," Marcus greeted first, using the alias Daniel had once gone by. Daniel smiled gently. He stood, removed his cap, and said softly, "No, my real name is Daniel Reyes. I'm the CEO of QuickBite." The room fell silent. Renee froze. Alicia's eyes widened. Marcus blinked, unable to believe what he'd just heard. In that instant, the man they had known as a fellow worker, someone who had washed trays, and scrubbed tables beside them, became something entirely different, a symbol they never thought they would meet so close. Daniel's voice trembled slightly, but it was steady and sincere. I came here to understand what's truly happening in this company. And I've realized the problem isn't you. It's us, the leaders. He paused, searching for the right words, then continued. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." QuickBite has been living in its own unconscious, ruled by fear, blinded by the shadow of profit and speed, forgetting the real people who make this company what it is. No one spoke. They simply watched him, waiting. Daniel took a deep breath. But today, I want to change that. And I'll begin with you. He turned first to Alicia, the woman who had spent 7 years in the kitchen, whom everyone fondly called the heart of the line. Alicia, he said, you're not just a great employee. You're the soul of this place. I want you to step into leadership. Starting today, you're promoted to assistant manager with a 25% raise, and QuickBite will grant you an additional $20,000 so you can fix your car, stabilize your finances, and come to work without worrying if your engine will die on the way. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her hands trembled as she listened. 7 years of labor, and for the first time, she felt seen, not for her hours, but for her worth. Daniel smiled softly. No one can shine if they're still shackled by survival. I just want you to have the freedom to stand on your own feet. He then turned to Renee, the woman who had worked the night shift beside him, still smiling though her voice had grown hoarse through a broken speaker system. Renee, he said, I'll never forget that night. How you managed to serve food and comfort customers even as the equipment failed. I realized then that dedication often hides deep exhaustion. That's why I've decided every drive-through intercom system across the country will be replaced. No one should suffer because of broken tools. And one more thing. I'm creating a store manager council where managers like you can meet directly with the executive board to share real insights from the front lines. You'll be its first member. And to lighten your own burdens, QuickBite will provide an additional $20,000 in support. You've cared for others long enough. Now it's time the company cares for you. Renee's eyes glistened. A tear rolled down, yet a radiant smile broke through. Thank you, Daniel, she said quietly. He nodded. Change doesn't begin with promises. It begins with listening. Finally, Daniel turned to Marcus, the young man who had once stood silent under verbal abuse, who had confessed, being talked to like trash makes me feel worthless. Daniel stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. Marcus, I'm sorry. What you endured was our failure. A decent company never allows its people to be treated that way. So starting today, QuickBite will implement a mandatory training program called Respect First, a foundation for every employee. And you, I want to help you fulfill your dream. We'll cover all tuition and books for you to return to culinary school. And I know your mother's been ill. The company will provide financial support so you can both have stability again. Marcus couldn't speak. He simply looked at Daniel, tears streaming down his face. I don't know what to say except thank you. Daniel shook his head gently. Don't thank me. Just do what you love. And do it with your heart. The room grew quiet again. Sunlight poured through the glass window, illuminating faces still wet with tears. In that moment, there were no titles, no CEO, no subordinates, only human beings, equal in dignity, bathed in a new kind of light, the light of understanding. Daniel's voice was calm but resolute. Carl Jung once said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking." I don't want QuickBite to be a place of power anymore. I want it to return to being a place for people. He paused, looking at the three of them, the foundation of the company's rebirth. I can't rewrite the past, but I can begin again. And I want to begin with you. They stood one by one. No one spoke. They simply embraced him. a quiet, trembling hug that transcended hierarchy. It was not a gesture between workers and a CEO, but between souls that had once been wounded and had now found each other again in the light of compassion. When they left, Daniel remained seated, watching the golden sunlight slide across the table. Before him lay his old employee cap, still carrying the faint scent of grease and smoke. He smiled. Now he understood. Leadership is not about command. It is about taking responsibility for the souls of those you lead. Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. There is no awakening without suffering." Daniel had walked through that pain, the pain of awareness, of remorse, of confronting his own shadow. But at the end of that journey, he had found something far more valuable: humanity. And in that quiet moment, he knew QuickBite would no longer just serve food. It would serve something far deeper: respect, compassion, and the dignity of being human. Part 12, The Declaration, the Future of QuickBite. Dusk settled over the parking lot of the first QuickBite store to be rebuilt. The red and white neon lights glowed against the glass, reflecting softly across the face of Daniel Reyes. The man once celebrated as the embodiment of speed, productivity, and success. Now he stood in silence, watching the stream of cars pass by like glowing arrows slicing through the night. For the first time in years, he felt no pride in the numbers. All he could hear were the human breaths, the quiet rhythms his company had forgotten for far too long. Throughout his undercover journey, Daniel had seen everything: the shouts echoing from the kitchen, the long, silent night shifts, the exhausted bodies pushed to the edge by mechanical systems and soulless routines. QuickBite, a name that once filled him with pride, now appeared before him as a living organism that had lost its soul. He understood then that the problem was never profit or strategy. The problem was how people had been treated, as tools, not as human beings. The next morning, Daniel walked into the largest meeting in the company's history. Hundreds of managers, employees, and partners filled the room. But there was no CEO in a tailored suit standing on the stage. There was only a man in a crew uniform. The same QuickBite cap tilted slightly to one side, his hands rough and scarred from weeks of work on the front lines. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice calm but firm. QuickBite isn't just a chain of restaurants. QuickBite is made of people. People who work late-night shifts, who struggle with hospital bills, with debt, and with dreams they've long forgotten. The room went still. Daniel raised his head. His eyes shone beneath the warm gold of the lights. We have failed, not in revenue, but in dignity. We have failed our own people. No applause followed. A few bowed their heads, some wiped their eyes. His words didn't sound like a speech. They sounded like a confession. But in that very silence, everyone could feel it. This was the beginning of something truly new. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain," and Daniel was living that truth. He did not hide from the pain or justify his mistakes. He chose to face them, within himself, within the organization, and within the wounded souls that had built it. After a pause, he continued slowly, "From today, we will no longer measure success by how many new stores we open, but by how many people feel respected when they put on this uniform." Then he announced 3 foundational changes. First, a complete retraining of the system, not just to teach employees how to cook and serve, but to teach leaders how to listen and respect. Second, fair profit sharing. Rewards would no longer stop at management, but reach the hands of every cook, every janitor, every night shift worker, because no one builds success alone. Third, decisions would no longer be made from the boardroom alone. Every idea, every suggestion from those on the front lines would go directly to the executive team. In the third row, Renee nodded quietly. Alicia, now a trainee manager, clasped her hands tightly. Marcus, still studying culinary arts under the company's scholarship, looked at Daniel with eyes glowing like faith reborn. Daniel's voice grew warmer. We once thought success meant speed, but speed without soul is only a storm. From this day forward, QuickBite will choose to be a small flame, but a warm one. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." Daniel smiled. QuickBite had been looking outward for too long, at rankings, at market share, at metrics. Now it was time to look inward, into the hearts that had been forgotten amid the noise of friars and ringing order bells. He paused, eyes distant, as though speaking to himself. We once chased speed and forgot people, but from this moment on, QuickBite will serve not only food, but dignity. We will not just sell fast, we will live true. The room erupted in applause, but Daniel did not stand as a victor. He bowed his head, not from modesty, but from understanding. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." And Daniel had done just that. He had embraced his shadow, the part of him that once believed people were merely resources. He had faced the fear of judgment, of weakness, of being seen as flawed. Yet, in that humble moment, he became a true leader, not by power, but by compassion. When the meeting ended, Daniel stepped outside. The sky was dark now. The QuickBite sign glowed brilliantly. But this time, he didn't see it as an advertisement. He saw it as the light of awareness, the illumination that appears only when a soul has dared to walk through its own darkness and return. As he drove home, Jung's words returned to him. The only real progress is in the development of the individual. Real progress, he realized, would no longer mean growth charts or expansion graphs. QuickBite would become something else. A place where people are seen, heard, and valued. A community of souls growing together. Through wounds, through fatigue, through compassion. Daniel looked up at the star-filled sky. He could feel something shifting. Not in the market, but in the hearts of the people. And he smiled softly with a lightness he hadn't felt in years, as if he had finally heard the true heartbeat of the empire he had built. It was not the rhythm of profit, nor of speed, nor of fame. It was the rhythm of humanity, of kindness rediscovered after years of silence. QuickBite was no longer just a brand name. It had become a promise that even in a world ruled by speed and ambition, human dignity can still endure if we are brave enough to look into the darkness and begin again with the heart.